I think we're probably ready to dive in. I'm sure we'll have some folks joining as we go through. Welcome everyone to Forced Migration Review's update event for FMR 74, Financing Displacement Response, which we published in November 2024. And we did hold a launch event for FMR 74 at the time, but the world of displacement response financing has changed significantly since we published the issue. So we're delighted that you all are here to join us in talking about this topic with an updated lens. Forced Migration Review brings together diverse, knowledgeable authors, especially those with lived experience of forced displacement, to foster practical learning and discussion that can improve outcomes for forcibly displaced people. And I, myself, am Emily Arnold Fernandez. I'm the Associate Managing Editor of Forced Migration Review. With me today is Jo Boyce, currently our Deputy Editor, who will be supporting tech and sharing relevant links in the chat. She's under the FMR banner as her name in the Zoom call. We also have our fearless leader, Managing Editor Alice Phillip, in the audience today. We invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name and if you'd like your organization and your location. And while you're doing that, I'll say a few words about the issue we're discussing today and then introduce our panelists. FMR 74, Financing Displacement Response, recognized that displacement response financing impacts many aspects of how we respond to displacement, what approaches are prioritized, who is involved, and how decisions are made. Traditionally, displacement response was financed by wealthy governments, humanitarian aid programs or agencies, and by diaspora community remittances. Over the last decade, however, new initiatives, such as World Bank brokered development investment and refugee-led grant-making to refugee-led organizations, among various other new initiatives and new approaches, have shifted both the types of financing available and the actors involved. And that in turn has shifted how displacement response happens. 6 months after the publication of FMR 74, in May 2025, traditional humanitarian funding from wealthy governments has now been dramatically curtailed, predominantly as a result of a shocking near shutdown of US government aid, which previously was responsible for an estimated 60% of global humanitarian aid funding, but also by less substantial but still significant cuts by other states that historically have supported humanitarian efforts, including displacement response. So the changes that we initially discussed in FMR 74, capturing evolution over a decade, are now yielding to even further changes that have happened in a very short span of time since November 2024. And so we're here today to revisit the topic of financing displacement response in light of this dramatic change in the landscape. I'm very, very pleased to introduce our panelists today. All of them authored articles in FMR 74, and they'll talk about what's changed in financing displacement response and how we might react. So first I'll introduce Mohamed Ahmed. He is the Director of Partnerships at the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative, also known as RELI, which is a coalition of refugee-led organizations that resources other refugee-led organizations to uplift communities and combat systemic refugee exclusion within displacement response. Mohamed and his co-authors wrote about independent research into RELI's participatory grant-making approach, and lessons from this research showed its value and its impact, but also showed ways to deepen accessibility and accountability for refugee-led organizations. We also have with us today Barri Shorey. She is the Senior Program Officer for Refugees and Disasters at the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, which supports solutions for some of the toughest challenges facing refugees and migrants. And I learned just today, just a few minutes before we started this webinar, that the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation also supports Instiglio, which Sebastian is representing today, and RELI, which Mohamed is representing. Barri and her co-authors wrote about refugee-lens investing, which engages the private sector to recognize refugees and other displaced people as economic actors and to invest in ways that yield improvements in refugees' lives and those of their host communities. We're very grateful to the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation for partnering with us to publish FMR 74 and for their collaboration in putting together this event to update the conversation. And finally, Sebastian Chaskel is an associate partner, sorry, not finally, but third, Sebastian Chaskel is an associate partner at Instiglio, Colombia, which partners with governments and aid institutions to improve the effectiveness of global development efforts through results-based approaches that incentivize impact. Sebastian and his co-authors wrote about results-based financing, which involves rewarding organizations if and when agreed-upon results are achieved, and how this approach can be used in forced displacement response, drawing on evidence from its successful use in Colombia. And finally, we have Maud Bachelet. She is a doctoral student at the University of Geneva, where she conducts research on responsibility sharing on displacement response in the European Union. Maud and her co-authors wrote about the impact of UN refugee agencies' heavy dependence on funding from a few Western states and the complexities of maintaining legitimacy as funding reforms are discussed. So, panelists, we're delighted to have you all here. Before we jump into our discussion, I'd like to let the audience know that if you have questions for our panelists, you can use the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen, to add questions at any time, and we'll pose these questions, or at least some of these questions, at the end of the discussion. I also encourage you all to sign up for Forced Migration Review's mailing list, which can be found on our website at fmreview.org, and Joe will put the link in the chat as well. And now to start our discussion, let's turn first to the recent changes in displacement response financing. So Mohamed, I'll pose the question first to you and then to the rest of the panelists in sequence. How are recent changes in global aid changing or nuancing the analysis or the conclusions that you wrote about? And what's different since you wrote your article for FMR 74? How would you change your recommendations in light of this? So tell us a little bit about the changing context for you.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here with everyone. So since we wrote the article, quite a lot has changed, as you mentioned, in the global aid landscape. One major thing that hasn't changed though is the gap between the promises made around localization and what's actually happening on the ground. One big shift, as you mentioned very rightly, is the recent aid cuts. We have seen massive cuts from major government donors specifically. And that isn't just a financial challenge. It's a warning sign of how fragile and top-heavy the system really is. When a few large donors pull back, entire support systems begin to break down. And that kind of centralization is risky and exposed by design. The recent, aid cuts only serve to amplify the importance of the availability of specialized pooled funding for RLOs, the topic of our paper, basically. Pooled funding earmarked specifically for RLOs maximizes the impact of every contribution, small or large, by collecting and redistributing to high-impact refugee-led organizations. Of course, RRLI or really believes direct financing is ideal. However, we have learned, over the past few years that direct funding to RLOs will require incremental progress. One important interim step to go around this is funding strategic, effective, and specialized pooled funds. Such pooled funds can help us get there, but only if they are the right kind. If they are not shifting power, if they're not centering local leadership, if they're not operating transparently, then they're not part of the solution. Such pooled funds, and this is what we wrote in our article, should be value-driven and proximate. What that means in practice, it means they are led or staffed by individuals with lived experience of forced displacement, It means they involve RLOs in governance and decision-making processes. It means they demonstrate a track record of equitable partnerships with local entities. And finally, they implement transparent feedback systems that allow RLOs to report, incidents of tokenism, for example, or funding misuse. We spoke about all of these approaches in our FMR article, and they have never been made more important. We're seeing some foundations are experiencing this with some RLOs, and that's really encouraging. But here is the catch. Mostly, it is still the exception, not the norm. So if we were to update our recommendations, we would just double down on this fact. Let's stop designing aid for systems and start designing it for people. Thank you.
Thank you. Barri, I'm going to turn the question over to you. Thinking about refugee-lens investing, how have the recent changes in global aid changed or nuanced the analysis or the conclusions that you wrote about? And, is there anything you would change in your recommendations?
Thanks, Emily, and what a privilege to be here with you and the other panelists. I'll do my best to keep up with these brilliant gentlemen and ladies, but I'm sure they'll put me to shame. And just plus 1,000 to what Mohamed just laid out. Couldn't be clearer about the specificities around the importance of pooled funding, but very specific types of pooled funds and what that looks like. So Mohamed, I hadn't heard that clear before, so well articulated. And like Mohamed, and grateful to the brilliant authors that I wrote this article with, we wouldn't change anything, and in fact further double down on what we sort of put forward. And I think, Emily, great idea in sort of reissuing this issue given all that's going on, because I think the issue was designed in mind with the idea that the current system doesn't work, and wasn't designed at all for what the world is like prior to USG funding cuts. And so FMR gave us all the chance to rethink that system and talk about actual finance, not aid. And so kudos to you guys and to all who wrote, because I do believe they all still hold even truer now. And just to sort of say, I think I've had some wonderful teachers in the refugee space, refugee leaders, talk about how the original system was designed decades ago as a care and feed model. And the idea that refugees were going to be temporary, they needed to be sheltered, they needed to be cared for, they needed food, and then would go on their merry way when conflict ended back. That's not the case today. There are many people on the line with lived experience who can speak otherwise. Displacement is average 15 years. More displacement, 80% of displacement is in urban areas. Refugee camps don't work anymore. And so if there is a silver lining that I'm trying to find of this horrific USG funding cuts and the way that they're cut, the silver lining is maybe this is a chance to burn the system down and start again. And I think some of that burning down, I'm being aggressive with my metaphor, but needs to be, who are the different players that need to be involved? Because the old players don't work. I think we need to rethink the engagement of what large-scale INGOs look like, what the UN looks like, and again, the silver lining to me of all this chaos is maybe we'll actually have a chance to do it. I was on a call earlier, some of you were on as well, with a refugee-lens investing community of practice, and we had wonderful speakers really discuss what it's like to put refugees at the center, and design infrastructure from a demand perspective. What do refugees need? What do they want? What do they require? And I think this is the opportunity to do it. And refugee-lens investing gives a new way of doing that. And the idea is that refugees and the markets and places where they live are investable. There are incredible ideas, there are incredible businesses, and market systems need to be developed in and around them that are inclusive. And how do we think about crowding in other folks to do that, and not it through this aid approach, but through an investment approach that looks at promising businesses, promising financial institutions, promising sectors and value chains within refugee and refugee hosting markets, and thinks not in terms of care and feed, but in terms of inclusion, in terms of investment, in terms of economic growth. And so my co-authors and I sort of described the evolution, and I'll give a shout out to Refugee Investment Network, to DRC and iGravity from the Refugee Investment Fund, and Acumen and their Forced Displaced Fund. So we all worked on this together, and the idea was to demonstrate and show what Acumen and DRC and RIN and us through funding. I have an incredible privilege of not having to actually do the work, but just identify wonderful humans who are doing the work. And the idea was to demonstrate what's happening in this space, what are the challenges, what are we seeing as issues, and ultimately call folks to action of thinking about the demand side of refugees, what they need, what they want. Again, in this morning's conversation, there was an incredible reminder of, as a flag of what the Eastleigh community in Nairobi looks like, how much of investment is not, or how much of the growth in Eastleigh is not from aid, but from remittances, from small business owners, and so how are we thinking about that? What is the demand from refugee and refugee communities in terms of support? And how do we design a system or mechanisms of finance around that, versus our traditional care and feed model? So I'll stop there. And just, yeah, again, want to give a shout out to all the wonderful folks on the line, hoping to hear your questions. And yeah, can't wait to hear what Sebastian and Maud have to say.
Thanks, Barri. Yes, Mohamed and Barri, thank you both. I have burgeoning follow-up questions, but I want to make sure that we hear from everyone to kind of lay the groundwork. So Sebastian, we'll move to you next. And again, how are recent changes in global aid changing or nuancing the analysis or conclusions you wrote about, and would you change any of your recommendations?
Great, thank you, Emily, and pleasure to be here. Thank you for everyone who's joined. I've also really appreciated everyone's introductions in the chat. If others would like to do that, that's really helpful to know who's on the line. So the article I wrote with my co-authors was all about the nuts and bolts about how a system could be different. Because as Barri mentioned, I think we would all agree the system right now, and especially the system we had before the right now, was not a system that was working all that well. And even though we would not have taken the actions that are being taken on now, I do think we recognize that the system wasn't perfect before. And what we included in our article was specific recommendations on how a system could be different. So when you think about the way that humanitarian funding, and in fact, in general, aid funding, development funding, is administered, it usually consists of preparing a budget where you say how you're going to spend that funding, spending according to your budget, and then getting paid for it. And in the end, you're really getting paid for being very good at following the rules and following compliance and spending according to the plan, but not necessarily for achieving results. And achieving results and spending according to the plan are not synonymous, especially in emergency settings, especially in settings where conditions change along the way. So what we shared in our article was examples from Colombia, from partners such as Semillas de Apego at Universidad de los Andes, from partners such as the city of Medellin, our work with the Fundación Santo Domingo in the city of Barranquilla, where we're testing out a different type of funding, which we call results-based approaches, which oftentimes means that you're tying funding to results, but also often means that you're tying funding to milestones along the way. So you may be familiar with theories of change. It basically means don't pay for the inputs or the receipts at the beginning, but something further down the theory of change, which may be results or maybe just something in that direction. And in doing so, what we see is providers have a lot more flexibility because they are not getting paid for spending what's in the budget, but rather for achieving the milestones and results that are in the end what we want to achieve with this funding. This, of course, leads to more efficiency, but also for more flexibility for the providers. If we were writing it again right now, what would we have said differently? I think we would have probably been more ambitious, because back then in November, we were giving examples of how this is being done in Colombia and making the case that this is something that is not being used enough. It's a tool that's in our toolkit, and we really need to use it a lot more. But right now, as Barri was saying, there is sort of maybe a silver lining to this, we hope there is, where we can really reimagine what a different system would look like. And I do think this is a great opportunity to make the system a lot more results-based and a lot less inputs-based. So it's really about changing the system so there's results accountability rather than accountability to meeting what's in a budget. And I hope that that's something that we can take from this conversation.
Thank you, Sebastian. Maud, I'll turn to you. And I'm very interested to hear, we've heard about some new approaches that can continue to be used or can be used even more extensively in light of kind of the demise or the shifts in traditional humanitarian aid funding. But you wrote about some of the biggest organizations, the biggest traditional organizations that respond to displacement. And so I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are about how recent changes may have changed or nuanced the analysis and conclusions that you wrote about.
Yes, thank you, Emily, and thank you to the FMR team and also to other panelists for their very interesting inputs. I agree with most of what have been said, and indeed, I wrote an article on this old system that is broken, so I will be talking from this perspective, which is a bit of a disclaimer. But I can only agree because in our article, we predicted that these big agencies would face a legitimacy crisis because they have to operate within two constraints, which is the first one, securing funding from state donors that are increasingly illiberal, and the other one is maintaining their humanitarian mandates of protecting individuals. And because these interests don't align anymore, we've seen that these agencies have engaged in a sort of balancing act where they uphold the humanitarian mandates in discourse, but then in practice, we see that they sometimes accommodate these state interests and practices that may go against this mandate. And as you all discussed very nicely, these drastic cuts of US funding have kind of exemplified a funding crisis that also accompanies, I would say, a more general destabilization of the international refugee regime that has been going on for some time now. And so this legitimacy crisis we talked about in our article is actually now in full effect. And this balancing act that these big agencies were engaging in, it's no longer an option. Like these UN agencies, they really need to reform their funding structure if they want to survive. But if I would have to nuance our conclusions, I would say that this crisis is perhaps going beyond what we had expected or what we were thinking about when we wrote the article, in the sense that we're not only challenging these big donor states, these organizations, the system that was put in place decades ago, but I also have the sense that states are challenging the notion of refugees and what it means to be a refugee under international law. And perhaps more importantly, they're challenging state obligations towards refugees and displaced persons. And so this legitimacy crisis is definitely taking place, and we definitely need to address it. But what worries me is that it's perhaps more profound than we had anticipated when we wrote the article and were gathering data on this. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, particularly with some of the recent news about proposals to reform the UN and to consolidate agencies, it appears that the funding crisis that you mentioned is also impacting how the United Nations is structured, including but not limited to the entities that respond to forced displacement. Looking ahead to the future, if we can kind of take a 10-year lens, I'm curious what you, first of all, well, I'd love to give the chance for a little bit of hope. So what would the world look like in 5 to 10 years if the recommendations and the new modes of working that you all have written about were put into place robustly? And then maybe bringing us back to a little bit of reality. What do you think the next decade will look like? What do you predict that financing of displacement response will look like in 5 to 10 years? And how will that affect people who are displaced? So Maud, maybe I'll go ahead and start with you this time and ask for your thoughts about, where you think where you think displacement response financing and displacement response as a field will be in 10 years. What would you like to see if your recommendations are put into place? And what do you think is most realistic?
Yes, it's never easy to kind of project yourself in the future and say what will happen 5 to 10 years from now, especially as was mentioned before, that the changes now are happening very, very fast at a pace that we didn't really expect. So again, my perspective draws on the international refugee regime, so this old broken system that we're talking about. And I think that compared to this, displacement response will become less institutionalized and more localized, in the sense that before we had this global, so-called global multilateral system established with treaties, interstate agreements. We had humanitarian principles enshrined in international humanitarian law. So we had this sort of like overarching framework under which displacement response was institutionalized and happening under. But I think that in the future, we will operate more and more outside of this framework, for the better or for the worse. And this will mean that we will rely more and more on ad hoc solutions that are perhaps more adapted to specific sources of displacement, and we will rely more and more on private actors. And I would say I'm not going to bring a very hopeful note, but maybe talk more about the risks that I see of such a future for displacement response, which would be that becoming less and less institutionalized will put more pressure on regions of the world that already face instability and are closer to conflict. And I think that it also has the risk of increasing conditionality of funding allocation for displacement, in the sense that donors will become more and more fragmented and polarized, maybe, meaning that now to acquire funds, one will need to adhere to the political preferences of these fragmented and polarized donors. And one risk there would be to exclude regions or programs or minorities that aren't seen as a priority by donors. And I think that this is perhaps a new challenge that not a new challenge, because of course it is the case already with earmarked state funding, but this is probably a trend that will be exacerbated if we go towards a less institutionalized and more localized displacement response.
Thank you. Thanks for that analysis. Picking up on one of the threads that you mentioned, that we may see more private solutions rather than a centralized public solution, I'd like to turn to Barri now and say, in terms of refugee-lens investing, what are you foreseeing that financing of displacement response could look like in 5 or 10 years if refugee-lens investing is really taken up? And what do you think is most likely? What do you think will likely happen in that regard over the next 5 years to 10 years?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And I think important to make a distinction too, right? I think we're all not saying that grants or non interest, or those types of programs shouldn't exist, right? I think it's thinking about the different, and back to this sort of demand and refugee-centered focus. There's a ladder. And so not all, and there was a question in the chat just sort of about specifically around the refugee investment facility and the requirements that it has, as well as things like acumen and whatever else. There's a ladder of looking at, and I think it's just taking this view of thinking about thinking about the private sector and market systems development as a solution to more sustainable refugee issues than what has been done in the past with care and feed. But the idea is that, and not all problems or not all demands will be met by refugee-lens investing, and we need to think about what that ladder looks like. So there are a lot of also wonderful organizations that Hilton is working with that are funding sort of lower on that ladder of small businesses that aren't yet investment ready, but could build up to those investments. Folks like Incomoco or Building Markets or Fundación 51 Labs, and other organizations that are looking at sort of closer to the ground businesses. And then how do we create this chain of handoff to be able to further develop the market. So you start with a grant and some technical assistance, move on to a loan and investments and things like that. And I think thinking about how what belongs where in what cycle, who's providing those services, and again shifting that service away from the care and feed to investments, to sort of moving along the investment ladder. And then in general thinking about how we can support infrastructure, banking infrastructure, technical assistance infrastructure, government infrastructure that allows for market systems in these refugee communities to develop. So that means access to work permits and access to bank accounts. And so how are we building the ecosystem that allows for these refugee-lens investings to have a long pipeline and to take place and to sort of have its own ecosystem? So I think those are the different puzzle pieces that we need to pull together. But I want to be clear to say that sort of refugee-lens investing isn't a magic bullet, but it's a step along a process that looks at refugee and refugee issues and refugee needs as investment opportunities, and sort of not this handout model. But I think, a lot of things also need to be supported to be in place to do that. Government systems, infrastructure, a pipeline, a strong pipeline of places where refugee leaders and businesses can go to access finance along that spectrum of investment. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Yes, and I think the FMR 74 is full of so many different ideas and new ways of
That's right.
responding and financing displacement response. So I don't think anyone is expecting that one answer will be the magic solution by itself. But it's exciting to talk about this as a potentially something that could be a bigger piece of the response in the future. And picking up on something else that Maud talked about, and that ties into what you've said, Barri, about recognizing the contributions and the assets that refugee communities bring. Mohamed, I'd love to turn to you. And Maud mentioned that we may see more pressure on specific regions, and often on regions that have fewer resources in the first place. But I'm wondering what you see, like when you're looking 5 to 10 years ahead, what could be the role of refugee-led organizations and pooled funds to support refugee-led organizations? How might that interact with this pressure on specific regions? What do you hope could be the case, and what do you predict will actually be the case?
Yeah, I'll just echo what everyone has said. It's just a bit hard to predict what will happen in 5 to 10 years from now. What I do think is we are moving from a system built on a few big pipelines of funding to one with many smaller streams, right? More scattered, more diverse, and definitely harder to predict. This shakeup is already reshaping the funding landscape, and it's likely to keep evolving. What's clear is that funding won't flow the same way it used to be. Like if I can give an example of like funding now used to flow primarily from government or foundation to INGOs or UN agencies to CBOs, and then only very rarely to refugee-led organizations. Probably much of the same approach from UN and INGOs, but I suspect the moment will require them to shift how they're doing things. Take Kristen Aid, for example. They recently downsized their international staff by about 45%. That move was ethical, but it was also potentially a move to stay relevant, right? So I imagine we will see more of that. With intention, coming back to your question, I think with intention, this moment could lead to more direct financing to proximate actors, right? With intention, it could lead to new types of intermediaries, pooled fund, more efficient, more accountable, and ideally led by people with lived experience and deep cultural understanding. I do think we might see some real progress toward localization. That's the hope. And hopefully, if some of these changes take place, that progress will extend meaningfully to RLOs, just as true partners, not just like a footnote, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sebastian, we'll turn to you, kind of picking up on these threads of new ways of resourcing displacement response and the likelihood that it will be a more fragmented landscape, a landscape less controlled by a few big funders. What does that mean for results-based financing and for some of the accountability approaches that you and your organization have been leading on? What do you think we could see in 5 to 10 years, and what do you think we will see in 5 to 10 years in that regard?
Thanks, Emily. So I do think we probably will move from more of a centralized way of funding to one that's perhaps more networked. And with this change, our hope is that we will see more granting go towards outcomes rather than towards inputs or receipts. And as Barry was saying, I do think there will be a move towards looking into ways to leverage the private sector through blended finance that might de-risk some private sector involvement. But grants and contracts will continue to probably be the majority of the funding. So I do think there's a huge opportunity there to improve the way that funding is being deployed. And that's what I'm hoping we'll see in 5 years. I do think we're sort of at a moment right now where we could take advantage of that opportunity to try to come up with a better system. And as Mohamed was saying, I do hope that that's a system that has more of a role for local organizations and RLOs. And I do think that performance-based funding or results-based funding, I do think it could be a tool for that, in the sense that oftentimes it's local organizations that really know how to deliver impact on the ground. But it is true that international organizations may be the ones that have developed the best capacity to work with the prior system, to demonstrate that they can comply with all of the rules and to demonstrate that they can meet all of the budget requirements. So if we move towards this system, which is a lot more results-based, I do think it could be helpful for having a more inclusive system in the future. And what does it depend on? I think it depends on all of us. So I think we do need to think about, as a community, how do we advocate for this to be a positive change, what's happening right now, or to at least take what's happening right now, and as Barry was saying, try to look at the silver lining and take it as an opportunity to try to come up with a better system.
Great. Well, on that note, I would love to turn to you as the first one of our panelists to answer the next question, which is really, what can we do? What should we do? How can we nudge displacement response financing onto, a track that will lead to the best outcomes that are possible in this context? And what should we be doing to give ourselves more reasons to hope?
Sure. So I think one important way, I'm very very curious to hear what the other panelists will say, because I think others may be better positioned to respond to that. But one way which I think is quite important is to share the success stories of what has already been achieved with this type of funding in the past, which is what we did with the article with the specific cases from Colombia. There are many others from other parts of the world. And I think we often don't talk about the successes as much as we should, and use them as models for what could be scaled up in the future. So I do think there's an important advocacy piece that we could all engage in.
Wonderful, thank you. Barry, I'll turn to you next. What do you think we can and should do to kind of nudge things onto the best possible track, given that we don't have magic wands and can't solve this entirely?
Yeah, I'm also keeping up with the questions just so that I can also frame my comments. Lots of good Q&A. I think there are a few things popping up that I just want to acknowledge. One, I think, to your question, Emily, the direct answer is more power, resources, decision-making, if not all of it, in the hands of refugees themselves, in the hands of the community leaders, the municipality leaders that are working on inclusion, in the hands of the governments that need support to move from care and feed to inclusion systems. And so I just want to acknowledge there is a huge opportunity here in the silver lining of acknowledging that large-scale INGOs and the UN system that donors like myself have been funding for years hasn't worked. And so where should resources go? To refugee-led organizations, to community-based organizations, and not through intermediaries that aren't themselves, as Mohamed described, not through other INGOs that promise to subgrant at crazy rates and I don't think UNHCR is prepared for or ready to give direct grants. And so I think, we really have, we're constantly at Hilton calling to action our fellow donors to say, let's stop funding the things we know that haven't worked and really, really directly resource community leaders, refugee leaders on the ground that are most proximate to the issues and know how to solve them. And I mean resource not in a way that considers this risks or crazy requirements or not allowing overhead or operations costs, because I think there's a bit of a catch-22 here of like, oh well, refugee-led organizations or governments don't have the ability to audit or identify risk. And it's like, well, why don't they have it? Because they can't hire a CFO or they can't hire. And so I think thinking about this chicken or egg. And so I also just want to acknowledge in the chat, there was sort of a flag for the irony in acknowledging that the system was set up to fail, but then not expecting this. And so, who are we advocating to shift along with us? And I think the entire system, and I think actors like Mohamed and really teams at RSEED and teams at APNOR have been calling for decades for refugee-led work. And I think it's time to listen. And I did expect this. I think a lot of us expected something like this, not at the swift pace, but that we were coming to an end of refugee systems working. And so agree with that sort of irony call out, and just to sort of say we need to sort of shift who's making the decisions around aid and investments. Yeah, that's my soapbox that I continue to stand on. So apologies if it felt soapboxy, but I'm very interested to hear what Mohamed has to say about all this. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I think then we'll turn to Mohamed and then to Maud to close us out. What can or should we be doing to put ourselves on in the best possible position to achieve the best possible outcomes in a world that is imperfect? Mohamed, over to you.
Yeah, it's a critical question in the context of our work, and from our perspective at RRLI, here's how we see it. We would just reconfirm our recommendation previously mentioned, focusing on pooled funding models as an interim step to unlock funding now, immediately, right? And, speaking from experience, I mean, because of our kind of unique positionality and life experience, we understand the importance of how we fund. So our approach is characterized by large, multi-year, and flexible grants to RLOs, transparent and culturally informed communication, tailored approach to capacity building, right? And again, we spoke about that in our FMR article, but perhaps an additional recommendation to this is to conduct research on the comparative impact of RLO investments on their community versus large national and international NGOs, given that we already have data, on localized funding, equitable partnership, meaningful participation. We just need maybe to make the case for RLOs and say that, like, show how impactful and cost effective they are to build donor confidence and justify larger investments. And research perhaps is the way to do this.
Thank you. And Maud, what about your thoughts? What else can we do besides what's been mentioned here to put displacement response financing onto a track that will lead to the best outcomes we can get to?
Yes, I have to echo what was said before by the other panelists, and I definitely think that we need to learn from our past mistakes and accept that this is a different period, that it was a system that was built by certain states in a certain position with a certain vision of the world, and lacking, completely putting aside perspectives of forced displaced persons. And I think that this is the component we need to put back at the center of the equation. And I also think that we shouldn't completely elude states' responsibilities, because I have the feeling that now we will increase the reliance on these private actors and these RLOs and other organizations, but this kind of gives an easy exit to states that are pursuing these really restrictive and illiberal policies and aren't taking responsibility, first of all, for the causes for displacement, for which they often have a role to play, but also their responsibilities towards displaced persons. And this is maybe the argument that I would add to this discussion, is that, yes, we need to change the way displacement financing works, and we need to learn from past mistakes, but we should still keep governments accountable and states accountable, as well as these large companies that do play a role in this system. And I don't think we should completely, I mean, I don't know if you get my points, but that they should be held accountable for their role in all of this, while learning from the past and not relying on this voluntary centralized system that has shown its limits.
Thank you, Maud.